The Colorado mountain town of Cedar Ridge was gripped by rage and fear. As dusk settled over the small community, word had spread like wildfire that the banker's daughter, sweet 16-year-old Mary Caldwell, had been found murdered near the creek that ran behind the town. The anger of the townspeople was looking for a target, and they'd found one in the most vulnerable person available. 16-year-old orphan boy Daniel Harper sat in the cramped jail cell, his wrists raw from the ropes that had bound him when the mob dragged him in. His face was bruised from the beating he'd received before Sheriff Morrison had managed to get him to safety, and his eyes held the terrified look of someone who knew he was living his final hours. Outside, the crowd was growing larger and more violent as the evening wore on. Voices called for immediate justice, for a hanging tree, for blood to pay for blood. The fact that no trial had been held, no evidence presented, seemed irrelevant to the mob that had decided Daniel was guilty. Into this chaos rode Jack Sullivan, a man whose reputation as both a former U.S. Marshal and current cattle rancher gave him respect throughout the territory. He'd been returning from a cattle drive when he heard the commotion and decided to investigate. "What's all this about?" Jack asked Sheriff Morrison, who stood nervously on the jail steps facing an increasingly hostile crowd. "The Caldwell girl was found murdered this afternoon," Morrison explained, his voice shaky. "The Harper boy was seen near the creek around the same time. The town's decided he's guilty." Jack studied the crowd, recognizing the dangerous mood of people who'd let emotion override reason. He'd seen lynch mobs before, and he knew how quickly they could turn from angry words to deadly action. "What evidence do you have against the boy?" Jack asked. "Well," Morrison stammered, "he was in the area, and he's got no family to vouch for him. And that's not evidence," Jack said firmly. "That's circumstance and prejudice." From inside the jail, Jack could hear the sound of quiet sobbing. Through the window, he saw Daniel Harper sitting on his cot, tears streaming down his young face as he listened to the crowd outside calling for his death. Jack made a decision that would put him at odds with an entire town. "I want to talk to the boy," he said. Sheriff Morrison looked nervous. "Jack, I don't think that's wise. The crowd's already worked up. The crowd doesn't get to decide guilt or innocence." Jack replied, "That's what courts are for." Inside the jail cell, Daniel looked up with red-rimmed eyes as Jack approached. The boy was thin from a life of scavenging and hard work, his clothes patched and worn, but his eyes held an intelligence and honesty that immediately caught Jack's attention. "Son," Jack said gently, "tell me what happened today." Daniel wiped his nose on his sleeve and tried to steady his voice. "I was fishing at the creek, sir. Same spot I always fish. I caught 2 small trout and was heading back to town when I heard people shouting. Next thing I knew, they were saying Mary Caldwell was dead and it was my fault. Did you see Mary today?" "No, sir, I hadn't seen her in weeks. Not since she gave me a sandwich outside the church after Sunday service." Jack studied the boy's face, looking for signs of deception. What he saw instead was grief and terror, but not guilt. "Daniel," Jack said quietly, "did you hurt Mary Caldwell?" The boy's response was immediate and heartfelt. "No, sir. I'd never hurt nobody, especially not Mary. She was kind to me when others weren't. She was the only person in town who ever treated me like I mattered." The sincerity in Daniel's voice convinced Jack that he was hearing the truth. This wasn't the response of a guilty person trying to cover his tracks. This was a grieving boy who'd lost one of the few people who'd shown him kindness. Outside, the crowd was getting louder and more agitated. Jack could hear someone shouting about getting rope, about not waiting for territorial justice, about taking care of the problem themselves. "They said they'd hang me at dawn," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking with fear. "Mr. Sullivan, I didn't do nothing wrong, but they're gonna kill me anyway." Jack looked into the boy's terrified eyes and felt something steel itself inside his chest. He'd spent years upholding the law, protecting the innocent, and ensuring that justice was served properly. The idea of an innocent boy being lynched by a mob offended every principle he'd ever stood for. "Not if I'm here," Jack said firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed to calm Daniel slightly. "You mean that?" "Sir, I mean it," Jack replied. Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm around. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe the courage this man shows protecting an innocent boy. But even as Jack made his promise, he knew the magnitude of what he was taking on. The entire town wanted Daniel dead, and standing between a lynch mob and their intended victim was one of the most dangerous positions a man could put himself in. Sheriff Morrison appeared at the cell door, looking more nervous than ever. "Jack," he said quietly, "you need to see this. The crowd's gotten bigger, and they're talking about storming the jail." Through the window, Jack could see torches being lit as darkness fell. The mob had grown to include nearly every adult male in town, and their mood was becoming increasingly violent. "How many men are we talking about?" Jack asked. "Maybe 40, 50 men," Morrison replied. "And they're armed." Jack calculated the odds: 2 men with limited ammunition against 50 angry townspeople who'd already decided on Daniel's guilt. It wasn't a fight they could win through force. "Daniel," Jack said, turning back to the boy, "I need you to listen carefully. Things are about to get very dangerous, and I need you to trust me completely." "I trust you, sir," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Good, because we're going to have to be very smart and very brave to get through this night." As the sound of the mob grew louder outside, Jack Sullivan prepared to make one of the most important stands of his life. He'd faced down outlaws, corrupt officials, and dangerous criminals, but he'd never faced an entire town determined to commit murder in the name of justice. The question was whether one man's determination to protect the innocent could overcome the bloodlust of 50 people who'd already made up their minds. As full darkness settled over Cedar Ridge, the mob outside the jail had grown to nearly 60 men, their torches casting dancing shadows on the wooden buildings. The sound of their angry voices had become a constant roar, punctuated by specific threats and demands for immediate action. Jack Sullivan stood at the jail window, studying the crowd and calculating his options. He'd sent word to the territorial marshal, but help was at least 2 days away. Sheriff Morrison was clearly too intimidated to be much use in a fight. It was essentially Jack and Daniel against an entire town. "Mr. Sullivan," Daniel said from his cell, "maybe you should just leave. I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Jack turned to look at the brave kid who was more worried about his protector than his own life, and felt his resolve harden even further. "Son," Jack said firmly, "I've never walked away from doing what's right, and I'm not starting now." Outside, the crowd had found a leader in Marcus Caldwell, the murdered girl's father. Caldwell was a prominent businessman whose grief had transformed into a terrible need for vengeance, and he was using his influence to organize the mob into something more dangerous than a random gathering of angry people. "Morrison," Caldwell shouted from the street, "bring out the Harper boy, or we're coming in to get him." Sheriff Morrison looked at Jack with desperation. "What do we do? I can't hold off 60 men with 2 rifles." Jack had been thinking the same thing, but he'd also been observing the crowd more carefully than Morrison. What he'd noticed was that, while the mob was large and loud, many of the men looked uncomfortable with what they were being asked to do. Mob psychology was powerful, but it was also fragile if the right pressure was applied. "Morrison," Jack said quietly, "how well do you know these people? Are they all killers, or are some of them just caught up in the moment?" "Most of them are decent folks," Morrison admitted, "but they're angry and scared, and Caldwell's got them worked up. Then maybe it's time to remind them who they really are," Jack said, against Morrison's protests. Jack opened the jail door and stepped out onto the porch, facing the mob directly. The sight of the respected former marshal standing calmly in their path caused the shouting to die down slightly. "Evening, gentlemen," Jack said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I understand you're upset about Mary Caldwell's death. We all are. She was a good girl who didn't deserve what happened to her." "Then step aside and let us have the boy," Caldwell shouted. "He killed my daughter, did he?" Jack asked, his voice remaining calm. "Were any of you witness to the crime? Did any of you see Daniel Harper hurt Mary?" The crowd murmured uncertainly, in their rush to find someone to blame. They hadn't stopped to consider whether they actually had evidence. "He was found near the body." Someone called out, So was everyone else who discovered her. Jack replied, "Finding a body doesn't make you a murderer." Jack stepped down from the porch, moving closer to the crowd. It was a dangerous move, but he was counting on their respect for his reputation to protect him. "I know most of you," Jack continued, his eyes moving from face to face. "Tom Henderson, you've got a boy about Daniel's age. Would you want him judged without evidence? Bill Murphy, your daughter is the same age Mary was. Would you want her killer to escape because we hanged the wrong person?" Some of the men began to look uncomfortable, but Caldwell wasn't ready to let reason interfere with his need for vengeance. The boy's got no family, no one to vouch for him. Caldwell argued, "He's been trouble since he got to town." "What trouble?" Jack demanded. "Name one crime Daniel Harper has committed before today." The silence that followed was telling. Daniel had been guilty of nothing more than being poor and alone. Easy targets for suspicion when people needed someone to blame. "Marcus," Jack said, addressing Caldwell directly, "I knew your daughter. She was kind to everyone, including Daniel. Do you really think she'd want an innocent boy to die for a crime he didn't commit?" Subscribe to our channel now. The incredible speech that follows will restore your faith in the power of moral courage. Caldwell's face contorted with grief and rage. "Don't you dare tell me what my daughter would want. She's dead, and someone has to pay." "You're right, Jack." "Agreed. Someone does have to pay. The person who actually killed her. But hanging an innocent boy won't bring Mary back, and it won't catch her real killer." A new voice spoke up from the crowd. "What if you're wrong, Sullivan? What if the boy really is guilty?" Jack turned to face the speaker, a rancher named Pete Collins, whom he'd known for years. "Pete," Jack said, "what if I'm right? What if we hang an innocent 16-year-old boy tonight? How do we live with that? How do we explain to our children that we became murderers in the name of justice?" The crowd was beginning to fracture, with some men stepping back and others arguing among themselves. Jack could see doubt creeping into faces that had been certain just minutes before. But Caldwell wasn't finished. "You're protecting a killer, Sullivan. That makes you just as guilty as he is." "I'm protecting the law," Jack replied firmly. "The same law that says a man is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, not by a mob in the street." "We don't need courts," someone shouted. "We know he did it." "How?" Jack demanded. "How do you know? What evidence do you have besides the fact that he's poor and alone and easy to blame?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Jack could see that many of the men couldn't answer it. Their certainty had been based on emotion and prejudice, not facts. "I'll tell you what I know," Jack continued. "I know that Daniel Harper is a 16-year-old boy who's been on his own since he was 12. I know he's never been in trouble with the law. I know he worked odd jobs around town and never caused problems for anyone. And I know that Mary Caldwell was kind to him when others weren't." Jack paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final argument. "I also know that somewhere out there, Mary's real killer is watching this mob and hoping you'll hang Daniel Harper. Because if you do, he'll never have to face justice for what he did." The impact of Jack's words was visible in the crowd's reaction. Men who had been ready to storm the jail were now looking at each other with uncertainty and doubt. But the confrontation was far from over, and Jack knew that Caldwell's grief and need for vengeance could still overcome reason if he wasn't careful. The real test of his ability to protect Daniel Harper was just beginning. As dawn approached, the standoff had evolved into something more complex than a simple confrontation between a mob and a defender. Jack's words had fractured the crowd's unity, creating factions of men arguing among themselves about justice, evidence, and the morality of lynch law. But Marcus Caldwell's grief hadn't diminished, and he'd gathered a core group of about 15 men who remained determined to see Daniel Harper hang. They'd positioned themselves around the jail, making it clear that they weren't going to be swayed by speeches about due process. Inside the jail, Daniel had heard every word of Jack's defense, and the boy's respect for his protector had grown into something approaching hero worship. "Mr. Sullivan," Daniel said as Jack checked on him during a brief lull, "why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me." Jack looked at the young man who'd been facing death with remarkable courage, and saw something that reminded him of his own difficult youth. "Daniel," Jack said quietly, "when I was about your age, I was falsely accused of stealing horses. A U.S. Marshal named Tom Bradley stood up for me when the whole town wanted to see me hang. He saved my life and changed my path forever." "What happened?" "He insisted on a proper investigation. Turned out the real thieves were the sons of the town's most prominent citizen. If it hadn't been for Marshal Bradley's courage, I'd have died for someone else's crimes." Daniel absorbed this story, understanding that he was benefiting from a debt Jack felt he owed to another lawman's courage. Years earlier, their conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Morrison, who burst into the jail with urgent news. "Jack," Morrison said breathlessly, "you need to know something. I've been questioning people about yesterday afternoon, trying to build a timeline. Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher, told me something important." "What is it?" "She saw Mary Caldwell yesterday around 3 o'clock, walking toward the creek. But she wasn't alone. She was with someone." Jack felt his pulse quicken. "Who?" "That's the problem. Sarah only saw them from behind, and she can't identify who was with Mary. But she's certain it was a grown man, not a boy Daniel's age." This was the breakthrough Jack had been hoping for, but it was also frustratingly incomplete. They had evidence that Daniel wasn't alone with Mary, but no way to identify the real killer. "There's more," Morrison continued. "I found tracks near where Mary's body was discovered. Boot prints that are too large to belong to Daniel." Jack studied the information, realizing they now had proof of Daniel's innocence, but still faced the challenge of convincing a grief-stricken father and his supporters. "Morrison," Jack said, "gather every person who was near the creek yesterday afternoon. Someone else must have seen something." But before Morrison could leave, they were interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Jack could see Caldwell and his core supporters advancing on the jail with ropes and grim determination. "That's it," Caldwell shouted. "We've waited long enough. The boy hangs now." Jack stepped outside to face them, his hand resting on his gun, but not drawing it. "Marcus, we've found evidence that proves Daniel's innocence." "What evidence?" Caldwell demanded. "Witness testimony that Mary wasn't alone yesterday. Boot prints that don't match Daniel's feet. Proof that someone else was with your daughter." "Lies," Caldwell snapped. "You're making up stories to protect a killer." But Jack could see doubt in some of the other men's faces. The mention of actual evidence was forcing them to reconsider their assumptions. "Then let's prove it," Jack said. "Let's bring out the witness and examine the evidence properly." "No more delays," Caldwell replied. "The boy dies now. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe the shocking revelation that's about to change everything." But as Caldwell and his men moved toward the jail door, they were stopped by an unexpected voice. "Wait," called out Dr. Emily Watson, the town's physician and one of the few people who'd been examining Mary's body. "I need to tell you something about how Mary died." The crowd turned to look at the middle-aged woman who'd been treating Cedar Ridge's medical needs. "For 15 years, I've completed my examination," Dr. Watson continued, "and I can tell you that Mary was killed by someone much stronger than a 16-year-old boy. The injuries indicate an adult man with considerable physical strength. That doesn't prove anything," Caldwell insisted, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "It proves that Daniel Harper couldn't have inflicted the wounds that killed your daughter," Dr. Watson said firmly. "The killer was at least 6 feet tall and probably weighed over 100 pounds. Jack looked at Daniel, who barely topped 5.5 feet and couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds soaking wet. "Furthermore," Dr. Watson continued, "I found fabric under Mary's fingernails that doesn't match Daniel's clothing. She fought her attacker and tore his shirt." The evidence was mounting, and even Caldwell's most devoted supporters were beginning to waver. But the grieving father himself remained unconvinced. "I don't care about your theories," Caldwell said desperately. "I want justice for my daughter." "Then you'll get it," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a man emerging from the morning shadows. It was Frank Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother, and his shirt was torn at the shoulder. "I killed Mary Caldwell," Frank said, his voice hollow with guilt and resignation. "I've been listening to all of this, watching you try to hang an innocent boy for my crime, and I can't let it happen." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs as Frank continued his confession. "I loved Mary," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I asked her to marry me yesterday by the creek. When she refused, when she said she could never love someone like me, I lost my mind. I grabbed her, and she fought back, and then," his voice broke completely. Sheriff Morrison stared at his brother in horror while Marcus Caldwell seemed to deflate, like a punctured balloon. "I was going to turn myself in," Frank continued, "but when I heard everyone blaming the Harper boy, I thought maybe I could get away with it. I thought maybe no one would miss an orphan." Jack felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as the truth finally came out. Daniel Harper was vindicated, but it had taken the near lynching of an innocent boy to bring Mary Caldwell's real killer to justice. 6 months later, Jack Sullivan stood with Daniel Harper outside the courthouse in Denver, where Frank Morrison had just been sentenced to life in prison for Mary's murder. Daniel had been completely exonerated, and the town of Cedar Ridge was still coming to terms with how close they'd come to committing murder in the name of justice. "What happens now?" Daniel asked as they prepared to return to Jack's ranch, where the boy had been living and working. "Now we go home," Jack said simply. "You've got cattle to learn about and a future to build. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of courage, justice, and second chances from the American frontier. Hit that subscribe button now, because these tales prove that standing up for what's right is always worth the risk." Daniel looked up at the man who'd saved his life and changed his future. "Mr. Sullivan, do you think Mary would be proud of what we did?" Jack smiled at the young man who'd faced death with dignity and emerged stronger. "I think Mary Caldwell would be very proud that her death led to justice, not vengeance, and I think she'd be proud of the man you're becoming." As they rode back toward Colorado, both man and boy understood that they'd been part of something larger than just preventing a lynching. They'd proven that courage and determination could overcome mob mentality, that truth could triumph over prejudice, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns, but with words and moral conviction. The cowboy had looked the orphan in the eyes and promised protection, and he'd kept that promise against impossible odds, proving that sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person willing to say, "Not if I'm here." Your subscription helps us continue bringing these incredible tales of frontier justice and moral courage to life. Subscribe now and join us for more amazing stories that prove anyone can be a hero when they choose to protect the innocent.